Alan, how do I get the... Oh. Okay. So my partner is a travel writer, and so we've kind of had a bit of a gypsy lifestyle for a number of years. We spent the last 2 years living in Zurich, in Switzerland, and it's only recently that we've come back to live in the US. So it was a wonderful time being in the middle of Europe, getting out and about. This magnificent space was something I was able to visit during that time. It's known as the Kaisersaal. It's in Würzburg in Germany, and it was designed by 18th century architect Balthasar Naumann. But I'm going to jump back a little bit in time and give you a bit of background. So that's me on my little foam surfboard. I grew up in the city of Melbourne, which is in the southeast corner of Australia and has an extraordinary coastline. I spent just about every summer on this beach. When the tide is out, it exposes large rock pools that are safe for swimming. It's like a series of water gardens dripping with seaweed. Each pool is like a world within a world. And when the tide returns, it becomes extremely dangerous and it's easy to be swept off the rocks. One of my fondest childhood memories is this 1960s set of Time Life books with fabulous illustrations that my parents bought. On the right is the ocean floor during the Cambrian era, 600 million years ago, when the first jellyfish and crustaceous life forms appeared on Earth. As a child, I always thought of this as some sort of sunken prehistoric ballroom. On the left is the kraken of Norwegian folklore. My mother is English and my father was born in Scotland. And when I was 10, we travelled to Europe to meet their extended families. We spent a summer in London, just around the corner from the Natural History Museum. And the highlight for me was the mammal room. I remember turning the corner and just confronting these scale replicas of whales and dolphins suspended from the ceiling. Film was also really important to me in my formative years. Filmmakers tapping into the baroque, such as British director Peter Greenaway, those two top images, and the French surrealist Jean Cocteau, the black and white images from his Beauty and the Beast, La Belle et la Bête, and Australian director Jane Campion, the film The Piano. So I went off to art school thinking I was going to become a gold and silversmith, but at the end of my first year, I felt the scale of sculpture was a better fit. So this is a fountain I made for a student exhibition of work installed in the moat of the National Gallery in Melbourne. So I was drawing on the Victorian architecture of Melbourne. This is this feature is known as a widow's walk, and so I was kind of taking that and turning it into a surrealist sea creature with tentacled cabriole legs. It's cast in cement fondue and it has bronze elements. It stands about probably about 6.5 feet high. So this is a larger fountain that I made for my first solo show out of art school. It was influenced by the huge ceramic stoves that heat European palaces, and I was also looking at Russian architecture. And this stands about 9 feet high, it's about 9 feet long. Several books that I encountered at art school were Umberto Eco's Travels in Hyperreality. Eco's chief area of study was semiotics, which is the study of communication through signs and symbols. It's a book of essays about the postmodern invention of America. In the essay Cult Movies, Eco sets out to deconstruct the 1942 film Casablanca and define what makes a cult film. Most films before Casablanca contained one or two genres, such as the war movie, the great escape, the romance. But Casablanca contains hundreds of genres. In fact, it's a mishmash of every genre that had been invented up until that time. Eco says one genre on its own is nothing out of the ordinary, but when genres are stacked upon one another, it creates something powerful that does move us. Eco also wrote The Name of the Rose, which was probably the first postmodern novel I'd read. It's a medieval murder mystery that's jam-packed with elements of life in a cloistered monastery. Tolstoy's War and Peace, an intimate family life contrasted with the struggle of power and politics. And finally, Susan Sontag's novel The Volcano Lover, set in Naples, Italy in the 18th century, centering around the life of Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador to Naples, who finds Vesuvius and the surrounding nature far more inspiring than the vulgarity of Neapolitan court. Rather than being a historical costume drama, Sontag continually fast forward to the present, presenting notes on the pathology of an obsessive collector, attitudes of the day towards women, and the morality facing each of the key characters. So film is a linear, time-based medium, and sadly I'm not wired that way. However, I was interested in using objects to construct narratives in a more non-linear, open-ended way. So this is my second solo show. It was in 1992 in Melbourne. I made all the objects in clay, wax and cardboard, and then cast them in aluminium. The harp is the same height as me, and it bears my initials, so it's something of a self-portrait. Each of the objects were based on historical objects, either from paintings or existing objects. So there are 9 objects in total, three of which are musical instruments. And for the content, I was looking to 17th century Dutch genre painters like Vermeer and his concert series of paintings, creating an intimate grouping. I wanted these objects to suggest the presence of the figure, but really have the viewer complete the tableau. In the mid-90s, I packed up my studio and moved to Europe and made Paris my base for the next 2 years. So it was fabulous to finally see buildings like Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. And I also, just living in Paris, was really exposed to some fabulous theatre. And the image on the right is a piece that I saw by a Spanish director. And this woman was initially dressed as like a high-class cabaret dancer in a tuxedo with a top hat. And she did this kind of striptease. And when she got down to the bodice and tore the bodice off, this incredible costume began to unfurl and inflate, and she was transformed into this crazy demon and rushed around the stage frothing and was finally kind of hoisted up into the heavens. So I didn't have a studio during that time, and couldn't really make any three-dimensional work, but I did a lot of drawing and recording ideas and keeping journals. And this has become a really invaluable part of my creative process and something I continue to draw from. So, travelling in Italy, I went to the Pitti Palace in Florence, and whilst queuing up to get my ticket, I made a drawing from a poster depicting a Medici pendant in the form of a sea god. The jewellery section of the museum was closed for renovation, so I never got to see the actual piece in the flesh, but it was something very similar to the piece on the right, which is the Canning jewel, which is at the Victorian Albert Museum in London. In the late 90s, I returned to Australia and started working with glass. And I So one of the pieces I really wanted to make was based on that drawing of the merman. And somehow I felt by making that drawing enabled me to kind of own that image and imagine remaking it at a larger scale and transferring it into a different context. So translating the precious materials of the original to something bordering on industrial. It's made of nickel-plated bronze, cast lead crystal, and the pearls are made from blown glass. It's about 5 feet in length. So I made the glass pearls after researching various methods that had been developed in 17th and 18th century France. In his encyclopedia, François Diderot illustrated the manufacturing of artificial pearls being blown from tubing of pearlescent glass. Nacreous or pearlescent pigments were concocted from ground up fish scales and then fired onto the glass. It was during the 18th century that costume jewellery first appeared. This was an effort to make keeping up appearances for the French court more affordable. On the right are 18th century patterns for earrings by Gilles Descarrés. If, in fact, any of these patterns were ever made, few examples survive to this day. Most patterns were soon broken up to be reset as fashions changed, or lost in theft, war, or revolution. So the solution I came up with to make large pearls was to use a small amount of opaque colour, which when blown thin becomes transparent, and then when mirrored inside creates a pearly lustre. This is another work from that time titled Purple Rain. Again, it's based on an 18th century hair ornament. It's about 4.5 feet in length. The colour comes from purple metallic foil attached to the back of the crystal forms. Foiling was another 18th century technique employed to create inexpensive jewellery. These are portraits of European aristocracy circa 1750. So they're showing diamond necklaces, girandole, pendant earrings, and hair ornaments. Aside from using original patterns, I also made tracings of jewellery as they appeared in historical paintings and made patterns from these. This piece is called Pussy's Bow, and it's about 3 feet in length. And then cutting and pasting that pattern of the bow, I wrapped it around the form of a slipper that I made and fabricated in metal and glass. So the glass slipper is about 17 inches high and 30 inches in length, and it's quite heavy to go clonking around in. The heel is solid crystal, and the smaller crystal forms are backed with pink foil. On the left is a picture of my maternal grandmother, and on the right is the same grandmother a couple of years later, wearing her brother's best Sunday suit. As a child growing up, knowing I was gay, but not knowing what that entailed, I think gay kids often look for clues. I remember seeing this photo of my grandmother in a man's suit and knowing there was something a bit odd about this, but it was something that I could identify with. This is my grandmother and her family going off to a village pageant. My grandmother on the far right, again dressed as a man, this time as the village dandy. So this show I titled Cinderella Complex. It was in the year 2000, so it was a kind of queer retelling of the Cinderella myth, narrated by 11 objects. Having sourced the images from the decorative arts, they have an inherent coding of the feminine. However, representing them at a large scale pushes them more towards a male convention of representation. In 2002, I headed back to Europe for a residency at the British Academy in Rome, which was a rich environment of Byzantine scholars, classicists, Renaissance scholars, archaeologists, the odd musician, and a handful of artists. I was able to tag along on daily excursions to hear a professor compare the architecture of Bernini with Borromini, seek out Caravaggio paintings in Rome, field trips to Pompeii and Herculaneum, and descend down into a cellar to see a part of Augustus's sundial. So it was an incredible 4 months. During that time, I studied the designs of Thomas Chippendale mirror surrounds from his book, The Gentleman's Director. And I decided to take a break from working with glass, as I'd been thinking of working with a material that was a little bit more forgivable and flexible. And having made moulds in both plaster and rubber, I'd always wanted to make something just using rubber as the outcome, and not just having it as an invisible part of the process. So I found this beautiful amber-coloured rubber, which had these sort of uncanny qualities. It mimics organic substances such as amber or honey, and lended itself to these organic plant-like forms. So these were extremely complex things to cast, but what I learned from making them gave me confidence to attempt something larger. Then in the fall of 2002, I moved to Boston for graduate study. It was the chance to connect with some contemporary art that wasn't readily accessible from the distance of Australia. I saw Matthew Barney's massive show at the Guggenheim in New York. This is a still from his film Cremaster 5. And another artist working with loaded imagery and moments of magic realism, Julie Heffernan. This is her self-portrait as Stone Woman. After admiring Julie's work for a number of years, I was fortunate to meet her on a residency, and we ended up collaborating on this work, which is based on a miniature diamond set portrait of Peter the Great. Living in Boston, I made many trips to Harvard's Natural History Museum, which houses an extraordinary collection of exquisite marine specimens in glass, such as these jellyfish and sea worms. They were made by Rudolf and Leopold Blaschke in the 19th century. And through the Blaschkes, I discovered the work of their contemporary, the 19th century zoologist Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel is renowned for his studies of jellyfish, or Medusa as they're known in ancient Greek. Haeckel's work was extraordinary for its time, staring down a microscope and attempting to render what he saw. As a disciple of Darwin, he also had some fairly extreme beliefs regarding the laws of nature, amongst which he saw symmetry to be of the highest order. Whereas today we now know chaos and mutation are indeed necessary elements. Even in his day, Haeckel was accused of intentional embellishment. His work virtually disappeared for much of the 20th century, only to be recently rediscovered. However, I think for where he went astray as a scientist, it gave me plenty of material to work with. I created a large pattern using Haeckel's chandelier engraving of a species of jellyfish called a disco Medusa, which I used to break down into the various elements and parts that I could then fabricate, making each form in clay, taking 2-part plaster moulds and casting each form in rubber. Then stitching the forms together using monofilament fishing line. Haeckel used his own studies as painted decoration in the house that he built for himself, called the Villa Medusa, in the German town of Jena. So this is my first Medusa, completed in 2004. It measures about 7 feet in diameter. Similar material, a different process. This is Iris van Herpen, Dutch fashion designer's digitally printed dress from her hybrid holism collection. Then combining the ideas of Haeckel's Villa Medusa and the ancient Greek mythological Gorgon sisters, I set out to make 3 large works, this time in a transparent silicone rubber. So this is my Villa Medusa shown in New York in 2006. This is this is Medusa on the right and Medusa on the left and Euryale on the left. Sorry, on the right. The story of Medusa is a story of love, betrayal, and revenge. I also wanted these works to channel some kind of something of this energy, supercell storm clouds. This is 4 views of Medusa, which is 9 feet in diameter and weighs about 800 pounds. And it's made up of about 1,000 cast rubber elements. And it's lit with fibre optics. This is the interior of one of the smaller jellyfish. As I'm sure you know, sugar's been getting a bad rap at the moment. Dr. Robert Lustig, specialist in paediatrics, recently wrote an article for the New York Times claiming that sugar is the primary cause of chronic illnesses such as diabetes, obesity, heart disease and hypertension. Also working within the tradition of Mexican sugar skulls for the Day of the Dead celebrations, I made this piece out of crystallised rock sugar, and it's titled White Death. In 2008, I made work for a show at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. The show was the projects of the show were to respond in some way to objects in the collection of the Legion of Honour, which houses the collection of European art. The Legion of Honour was founded on sugar cropping fortune, as it turns out, by the original sugar daddy, Adolf Spreckels, and his wife, Alma. Alma Spreckels' story was one of rags to riches, and despite Alma's rise in fortune and Cinderella-like transformation, she could never quite shake off her humble beginning. So I set out to make a 3/4 scale carriage referencing a Neapolitan sedan chair that Alma had acquired. I made the form from plywood and steel and added the scrolling details with scrunched aluminum foil. Then set about encrusting it in crystallised rock sugar. All the sugar came from an Asian grocery store in Albuquerque. I emptied the shelves and filled about 4 shopping carts. I got to the checkout and the cashier looked at me dryly and said, "Doing some baking, are you?" So this is in my studio, applying the sugar to the structure and then sealing it with an amber-coloured shellac. On the left is a detail of the carriage, and the interior I wanted to create like a crystal cavern. In the centre, making this work reminded me of another ambitious collector, Catherine the Great, whose amber room had been one of the fabled 8 wonders of the world. The amber room's intricately carved amber panels stood in a palace near St. Petersburg for nearly 300 years before the invading Nazi army wrenched the panels from the walls, stole them away, where they most likely perished in a fire. On the right is it's an image from Carlsbad Caverns, a series of fabulous caves in southern New Mexico. I titled the carriage Motherlode, which is a reference to mining and minerals. And I think also living in New Mexico, I was kind of influenced by the Spanish-Mexican Baroque. Rock candy is grown in special liquid vats, similar to how quartz crystal is formed in nature, with an accelerated process. So this is the work complete and set up in my studio just prior to me creating and transporting it to San Francisco. I drove the work there myself, and it was one of the most fabulous road trips I've ever done in a rented U-Haul. It was 1,500 miles, and I chose to take the scenic route and went via Lake Tahoe, which was a big mistake because it was probably the bumpiest section of road I encountered, and I was fearing arriving at the Diang with crates full of piles of crumbs, but fortunately everything survived pretty well. I also made a rock sugar chandelier, and it was really a combination of these 2 crystal chandeliers that hang in the Legion of Honour and a part of a suite of furniture that belonged to Marie Antoinette. I combined the formal structure of the one on the left with the bulk of the carved rock crystal drops on the right. When we were installing this piece at the Diang, a woman passing through the museum asked if the chandelier was made of amber. She'd grown up in Russia and as a child visited palaces with carved amber chandeliers. There's a passage in Sontag's novel, The Volcano Lover, where she describes a volcanic shower of hot stones as being like a girandole earring. So these are the works installed. The show is called Bitter Sweet. And this was the 3rd piece in the show. It's called Sweet Thing. Pearls themselves have an interesting history. The natural formation of pearls was shrouded in mystery for centuries. Pearls have been attributed mystical qualities. Ground and crushed pearls were an essential ingredient in the elixir of life. The emperors of China were buried with an enormous pearl placed in their mouth, thought to preserve the body for the afterlife. So this brings me to more recent work, where I started combining the 2 sources that I've been working with this past decade, using patterns of 17th century jewellery as an initial form though this time layered with Haeckel's studies of nature, like these studies of lichen. This piece is titled Tree of Heaven. The metal work is taking on a highly wrought organic quality. It's about 80 inches in height, and it was. I made this piece for the Armoury show last week. It's a detail. And a sister piece. It's also about 80 inches in height. So the glass is mirrored blown glass, and the tree section is nickel plated bronze. These are 19th century studies of coral, which I used to create this next piece. This one's titled Gorgonian. The name comes from a predatory species of sea fan, otherwise known as a Venetian fan. This one's about 5 feet in length. That large pearl is about the size of a watermelon. That's another Gorgonian. These last three pieces were shown at the Armoury last week. I'm also really inspired by these illustrations of the Kunstkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, which were the precursor to museums in Renaissance Europe. Kunstkammers were encyclopedic collections of curious objects. This is the largest piece I've made in this series. It stands about 8 feet in height. It's a detail. Lichen is something I've also begun photographing and working from. For me, there's a real connection between these two images. I feel kind of like what I'm doing is beginning with the Baroque and then dialing it back to something less structured. The pattern's starting to kind of break down and get submerged. And these are my last slides. On the left is a study of local Vermont lichen. And this is the miracle of digital photography. With the naked eye, this lichen looks like an unremarkable mossy blob. But downloaded in iPhoto, suddenly this alien form springs to life. And on the right is something I made more than a decade ago. It's a piece called Bearded Clam. But it's an image I will be reworking and giving it a kind of like a lichen makeover. Mm-hmm. So, thank you. Mm.